when an early galaxy began to pour light out into the surrounding darkness. No witness could have known that billions of years later, some remote clumps of rock and metal, ice and organic molecules would fall together to make a place called Earth, or that life would arise and thinking beings evolve who would one day capture a little of that galactic light and try to puzzle out what had sent it on its way. And after the Earth dies some 5 billion years from now, after it is burned to a crisp or even swallowed by the sun, there will be other worlds and stars and galaxies coming into being, and they will know nothing of a place once called Earth. It almost never feels like prejudice. Instead, it seems fitting and just. The idea that because of an accident of birth, our group, whichever one it is, should have a central position in the social universe. Among pharaonic princelings and Plantagenet pretenders, children of robber barons and Central Committee bureaucrats, street gangs and conquerors of nations, members of confident majorities, obscure sects, and reviled minorities, this self-serving attitude seems as natural as breathing. It draws sustenance from the same psychic wellsprings as sexism, racism, nationalism, and the other deadly chauvinisms that plague our species. Uncommon strength of character is needed to resist the blandishments of those who assure us that we have an obvious, even God-given superiority over our fellows. The more precarious our self-esteem, the greater our vulnerability to such appeals. Since scientists are people, it's not surprising that comparable pretensions have insinuated themselves into the scientific worldview. Indeed, many of the central debates in the history of science seem to be, in part at least, contests over whether humans are special. Almost always, the going-in assumption is that we are special. After the premise is closely examined, though, it turns out, in dishearteningly many cases, that we are not. Our ancestors lived out of doors. They were as familiar with the night sky as most of us are with our favorite television programs. The sun, the moon, the stars, and the planets all rose in the east and set in the west, traversing the sky overhead in the interim. The motion of the heavenly bodies was not merely a diversion, eliciting a reverential nod and a grunt. It was the only way to tell the time of day and the seasons. For hunters and gatherers, as well as for agricultural peoples, knowing about the sky was a matter of life and death. How lucky for us that the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars are part of some elegantly configured cosmic clockwork. It seemed to be no accident. They were put here for a purpose, for our benefit. Who else makes use of them? What else are they good for? And if the lights in the sky rise and set around us, isn't it evident that we're at the center of the universe? These celestial bodies, so clearly suffused with unearthly powers, especially the sun, on which we depend for light and heat, circle us like courtiers forming on a king. Even if we had not already guessed, the most elementary examination of the heavens reveals that we are special. The universe seems designed for human beings. It's difficult to contemplate these circumstances without experiencing stirrings of pride and reassurance. The entire universe made for us. We must really be something. This satisfying demonstration of our importance, buttressed by daily observations of the heavens, made the geocentrist conceit a transcultural truth. Taught in the schools, built into the language, part and parcel of great literature and sacred scripture. Dissenters were discouraged, sometimes with torture and death. It is no wonder that for the vast bulk of human history, no one questioned it. It was doubtless the view of our foraging and hunting ancestors. The great astronomer of antiquity, Claudius Ptolemy. In the 2nd century, he knew that the Earth was a sphere, knew that its size was a point compared to the distance of the stars, and taught that it, quote, lay right in the middle of the heavens, close quote. Aristotle, Plato, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and almost all the great philosophers and scientists of all cultures over the 3,000 years ending in the 17th century bought into this delusion. Some busied themselves figuring out how the sun, the moon, the stars, and the planets could be cunningly attached to perfectly transparent crystalline spheres. The big spheres, of course, centered on the Earth, that would explain the complex motions of the celestial bodies so meticulously chronicled by generations of astronomers. And they succeeded. With later modifications, the geocentric hypothesis adequately accounted for the facts of planetary motion as known in the 2nd century and in the 16th. From there, it was only a slight extrapolation to an even more grandiose claim that the perfection of the world would be incomplete without humans, as Plato asserted in the Timaeus. Man is all, the poet and cleric John Donne wrote in 1625. He is not a piece of the world, but the world itself. And next to the glory of God, the reason why there is a world, said John Donne. And yet, never mind how many kings, popes, philosophers, scientists, and poets insisted on the contrary, the Earth, through those millennia, stubbornly persisted in orbiting the sun. You might imagine an uncharitable extraterrestrial observer looking down on our species over all that time, with us excitedly chattering, the universe created for us, we're at the center, everything pays homage to us, and concluding that our pretensions are amusing, our aspirations pathetic, that this must be the planet of the aliens. But such a judgment is too harsh. We did the best we could. There was an unlucky coincidence between everyday appearances and our secret hopes. We tend not to be especially critical when presented with evidence that seems to confirm our prejudices. And there was little countervailing evidence. In muted counterpoint, a few dissenting voices counseling humility and perspective could be heard down through the centuries. At the dawn of science, the atomist philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome, those who first suggested that matter is made of atoms, Democritus, Epicurus, and their followers, and Lucretius, the first popularizer of science, they scandalously proposed many worlds and many alien life forms, all made of the same kinds of atoms as we. They offered for our consideration infinities in space and time. But in the prevailing canons of the West, secular and sacerdotal, pagan and Christian, atomist ideas were reviled. Instead, the heavens were not at all like our world. They were unalterable and perfect. The earth was mutable and corrupt. The Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero summarized the common view. In the heavens, he said, there is nothing of chance or hazard, no error, no frustration, but absolute order, accuracy, calculation, and regularity. Close quote. Philosophy and religion cautioned that the gods, or God, were far more powerful than we, jealous of their prerogatives, and quick to mete out justice for insufferable arrogance. At the same time, these disciplines had not a clue that their own teaching of how the universe is ordered was a conceit and a delusion. Philosophy and religion presented mere opinions, opinion that might be overturned by observation and experiment as certainty. This worried them not at all. That some of their deeply held beliefs might turn out to be mistakes was a possibility hardly considered. Doctrinal humility was to be practiced by others. Their own teachings were inerrant and infallible. In truth, they had better reason to be humble than they knew. Beginning with Copernicus in the middle 16th century, the issue was formally joined. The picture of the sun rather than the earth at the center of the universe was understood to be dangerous. Obligingly, many scholars were quick to assure the religious hierarchy that this newfangled hypothesis represented no serious challenge to conventional wisdom. In a kind of split-brain compromise, the sun-centered system was treated as a mere computational convenience, not an astronomical reality. That is, the Earth was really at the center of the universe, as everybody knew. But if you wished to predict where Jupiter would be on the second Tuesday of November the year after next, you were permitted to pretend that the sun was at the center. Then you could calculate away and not affront the authorities. This has no danger in it, wrote Robert Cardinal Bellarmine, the foremost Vatican theologian in the early 17th century. And suffices, he continued, for the mathematicians. But to affirm that the sun is really fixed at the center of the heavens, and that the earth revolves very swiftly around the sun, is a dangerous thing, Cardinal Bellarmine went on, not only irritating the theologians and philosophers, but injuring our holy faith and making the sacred scripture false. Freedom of belief is precious. Besides, if there's the nearby stars seem to move against the background of distant stars, and every 6 months perspective from one side of the Earth to the other. The Copernicans argued that this was because the stars were extremely far away, maybe 1 million times more distant than the Earth is from the Sun. Perhaps better telescopes in future times would find an end to the geocentrists considered this a desperate attempt to save a flawed hypothesis and ludicrous offensive. When Galileo turned the astronomical telescope to the sky, the tide began to turn. He discovered that Jupiter had a little moon circling it, the inner ones orbiting faster than the outer ones, just as Copernicus had deduced for the motion of the planets around the sun. He found that Mercury and Venus were the creator inspired sun changed the projection patterns. This may in part constitute the sort of trouble have done with prying into the regions of the sky, into the destiny and secrets of the universe, close quote. In contrast, Galileo taught that we can interrogate nature by observation and experiments. Then, quote, facts which at first sight seem improbable will, on scant explanation, drop the cloak which includes and stand forth in naked and simple beauty, close quote. Are not these facts, available even for skeptics to confirm, a surer insight to the universe than all the speculation of the theologians? Likewise, these facts contradict the beliefs of those who believe that religion can keep us in the mistakes. The princes of the church threatened the religious with torture if he persisted in teaching the abominable doctrine that the earth was round. He was sentenced to a kind of house arrest for the remainder of his life. A generation or two later, by the time Isaac Newton demonstrated that simple and elegant physics could quantitatively explain and predict all the observed lunar and planetary motions, provided the use of the sun at the center of the solar system, the geocentrist conceit eroded further. In 1725, in an attempt to discover stellar parallax, the painstaking English amateur astronomer James Bradley stumbled on the aberration of light. The term aberration, I suppose, conveys something that one would expect of the discoverer. When observed over the course of the year, stars were found to trace little ellipses against the sky. But all the stars were found to do so. This could not be stellar parallax, where we would expect big parallax from nearby stars, and undetectable for far-away stars. Instead, aberration is similar to how rainbows Earth was stationary at the center of the universe, and not speeding in its orbit around the sun, Bradley would not have found the aberration of light. It was a compelling demonstration that the Earth revolved about the sun. It convinced most astronomers and some others, but not, Bradley thought, the anti-Copernicans. But not until 1837 did direct observations of the stars prove in the clearest way that the Earth is indeed circling the sun. The long-debated annual parallax was at last discovered, not by better arguments, but by better instruments. Because explaining what it means is much more straightforward than explaining the aberration of light, its discovery was very important. It pounded the final nail into the coffin of geocentrism. You need only look at your finger with your left eye, and then with your right, and see it seem to move. Everybody can understand parallax. By the 19th century, all scientific geocentrists had been converted or rendered extinct. Once most scientists had been convinced, informed public opinion had swiftly changed, in some countries in a mere 3 or 4 generations. Of course, in the time of Galileo and Newton, and even much later, there were still some who objected, who tried to prevent the new sun-centered universe from becoming accepted or even known. And there were many who at least harbored secret reservations. By the late 20th century, just in case there were any holdouts, we were able to settle the matter directly. We've been able to test whether we live in an Earth-centered system with planets affixed to transparent crystal spheres, or in a sun-centered system with planets controlled at a distance by the gravity of the sun. We have, for example, probed the planets with radar. When we bounce a signal off the moon of Saturn, we receive no radio echo from a nearer crystal sphere attached to Jupiter. Our spacecraft arrive at their appointed destinations with astonishing precision, exactly as predicted by Newtonian gravitation. When our ships fly to Mars, say, their instruments do not hear a tinkling sound or detect shards of broken crystal as they crash through the spheres, but that, according to the authoritative opinions that prevailed for millennia, propel Venus or the Sun in their dutiful motions about the central Earth. When Voyager 2 scanned the solar system from beyond the outermost planet, it saw, just as Copernicus and Galileo had said we would, the sun in the middle, and the planets in concentric orbits about it. Far from being the center of the universe, the Earth is just one of the orbiting dots. No longer confined to a single world, we are now able to reach out to others and determine decisively what kind of planetary system we inhabit. Every other proposal, and their number is legion, to displace us from the cosmic center stage has also been resisted, in part for similar reasons. We seem to crave privilege, merited not by our works, but by our birth. By the mere fact that, say, we're humans and born on Earth. We might call it the anthropocentric, the human-centered conceit. This conceit is brought close to culmination in the notion that we are created in God's image. The creator and ruler of the entire universe looks just like me. My, what a coincidence. How convenient and satisfying. The 6th century BC Greek philosopher Xenophanes understood the arrogance of this perspective. Here's what he said. The Ethiopians make their gods black and snub-nosed. The Thracians say theirs have blue eyes and red hair. Yes, and if oxen and horses or lions had hands, and could paint with their hands, and produce works of art as men do, horses would paint the forms of the gods like horses, and oxen like oxen. Such attitudes were once described as provincial. The naive expectation that the political hierarchies and social conventions of an obscure province extend to a vast empire composed of many different traditions and cultures. That the familiar boondocks, our boondocks, are the center of the world. The country bumpkins know almost nothing about what else is possible. They fail to grasp the insignificance of their province or the diversity of the empire. With ease, they apply their own standards and customs to the rest of the planet. lesson in humility waiting at every stop. Many passengers would rather have stayed home. Chapter 3. The Great Demotions. One philosopher asserted that he knew the whole secret. He surveyed the two celestial strangers from top to toe, and maintained to their faces that their persons, their worlds, their suns and their stars were created solely for the use of man. At this assertion, our two travelers let themselves fall against each other, seized with a fit of inextinguishable laughter. That's from Voltaire's Nicomedes in 1752. In the 17th century, there was still some hope that even if the Earth was not the center of the universe, it might be the only world. But Galileo's telescope revealed that, quote, the moon certainly does not possess a smooth and polished surface, close quote, and that other worlds might look just like the face of the Earth itself. The moon and the planets showed unmistakably that they had as much claim to be worlds as the Earth does, with mountains, craters, atmospheres, polar ice caps, clouds, and, in the case of Saturn, a dazzling, unheard of set of circumferential rings. After millennia of philosophical debate, the issue was settled decisively in favor of what was called the plurality of worlds. They might be profoundly different from our planet. None of them might be as congenial for life, but the Earth was hardly the only one. This was the next in the series of great demotions, downlifting experiences, demonstrations of our apparent insignificance, wounds that science has in its search for Galileo's facts, delivered to you in pride. Well, some hoped, even if the Earth isn't at the center of the universe, the Sun is. The Sun is our Sun. So the Earth is approximately at the center of the universe. Perhaps some of our pride could in this way be salvaged. But by the 19th century, observational astronomy had made it clear that the Sun is but one lonely star in a great self-gravitating assemblage of suns called the Milky Way galaxy. Far from being at the center of the galaxy, our Sun, with its entourage of dim, tiny planets, lies in an undistinguished sector of an obscure spiral arm. We are 30,000 light years from the center. Well, our Milky Way is the only galaxy. The Milky Way galaxy is in fact one of billions, perhaps hundreds of billions, of galaxies notable neither in mass, nor in brightness, nor in how its stars are configured and arrayed. Some modern deep sky photographs show more galaxies beyond the Milky Way than stars within the Milky Way. Every one of them is an island universe containing perhaps 100 billion suns. Such an image is a profound sermon on humility. Well then, at least our galaxy is at the center of the universe. No, this is wrong too. When the expansion of the universe was first discovered, many people naturally gravitated to the notion that the Milky Way was at the center of the expansion, and all the other galaxies were running away from us. We now recognize that astronomers on any galaxy would see all the others running away from them. Unless they were very careful, they would all conclude that they were at the center of the universe. There is, in fact, no center to the expansion, no point of origin of the Big Bang, at least not in ordinary three-dimensional space. Well, even if there are hundreds of billions of galaxies, each with hundreds of billions of stars, no other star has planets. If there are no other planets beyond our solar system, perhaps there's no other life in the universe. Our uniqueness might then be saved. Since planets are small and feebly shine by reflected sunlight, they're hard to find. Although applicable technology is improving with breathtaking speed, even a giant world like Jupiter, orbiting the nearest star, Alpha Centauri, would still be difficult to detect. In our ignorance, the geocentrists find hope. There was once a scientific hypothesis, not just well received but prevailing, that supposed our solar system to have formed through the near collision of the ancient sun with another star. The gravitational tidal interaction pulled out tendrils of sun stuff that quickly condensed into planets. Since space is mostly empty and near-stellar collisions most rare, it was concluded that few other planetary systems exist. Perhaps only one, around that other star that long ago co-parented the worlds of our solar system. Early in my studies, I was amazed and disappointed that such a view had ever been taken seriously, that for planets of other stars, absence of evidence had been considered evidence of absence. Today, we have firm evidence for at least 3 planets orbiting an extremely dense star, the pulsar designated B1257 plus 12, and we found for more than half the stars with masses like the sun's that early in their careers, they're surrounded by great disks of gas and dust, out of which planets seem to form. Other planetary systems now look to be a cosmic commonplace, maybe even world something like the Earth. We should be able in the next few decades to inventory at least the largest planets, if they exist, of hundreds of nearby stars. Well, if our position in space doesn't reveal our special role, our position in time does. We've been in the universe since the beginning, give or take a few days. We've been given special responsibilities by the Creator. It once seemed very reasonable to think of the universe's beginning just a little before our collective memory is obscured by the passage of time, and also the illiteracy of our ancestors. Generally speaking, that's hundreds or maybe thousands of years ago. Religions that purport to describe the origin of the universe often specify, implicitly or explicitly, a date of origin of roughly such vintage, a birthday for the world. If you add up all the begats in the book of Genesis, for example, you get an age for the earth, 6,000 years old, plus or minus a little. The universe is said to be exactly as old as the earth. This is still the standard of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim fundamentalists, and is clearly reflected in the Jewish calendar. But so young a universe raises an awkward question. How is it that there are astronomical objects more than 6,000 light years away? It takes light a year to travel a light year, 10,000 years to travel 10,000 light years, and so on. When we look at the center of the Milky Way galaxy, the light we see left its source some 30,000 years ago. The nearest spiral galaxy like our own, M31 in the constellation Andromeda, is 2 million light years away. So we're seeing it as it was when the light from it set out on its long journey to Earth 2 million years ago. And when we observe distant quasars 5 billion light years away, we're seeing them as they were 5 billion years ago before the Earth was formed. They are almost certainly very different today. So despite this, we will accept the literal truth of such religious books. How could we reconcile the data? The only plausible conclusion, I think, is that God recently made all the photons of light arriving on the Earth in such a coherent format as to mislead generations of astronomers into the misapprehension that there are such things as galaxies and quasars, and intentionally driving them to the spurious conclusion that the universe is vast. This is such a malevolent theology, I still have difficulty believing that anyone, no matter how devoted to the divine inspiration of any religious book, could seriously entertain. Beyond this, the radioactive dating of rocks, the abundance of impact craters and meteors, the evolution of the stars, and the expansion of the universe each provides compelling and that a universe is many billions of years old. Despite the confident assertions of revered theologians that a world symbol directly contradicts the word of God, and that at any rate, information on the antiquity of the world is inaccessible except to faith. These lines of evidence as well would have to be manufactured by a deceptive and malicious deity, unless the world is much older than the literalists in the Judeo-Christian Islamic religion suppose. Of course, no such problem arises for those non-religious people who choose the Bible and the Quran as historical, moral guides and great literature. But we recognize that the perspective of these scriptures in the natural world reflects the rudimentary science of the time in which they were written. Ages roll by before the earth began. More ages will run their course before it is destroyed. A distinction needs to be drawn between how old the earth is, about 4.5 billion years, and how old the universe is, about 15 billion years since the Big Bang. The immense interval of time between the origin of the universe and our epoch was 2/3 over before the earth came to be. Some stars and planetary systems are billions of years younger, others billions of years older. But in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, the universe and the earth are created on the same day. The Buddhist Jain religion tends not to make between us. As for humans, we're icons. We appear in the last instant of cosmic time. The history of the universe torn out is 8% over before our species arrived on the scene. In that vast sweep of eons, we could not have assumed any special responsibilities for our planet, or life, or anything else. We were not here. Well, if you can't find anything special about our position or our epoch, maybe there's something special about our motion. Newton and all the great classical physicists held that the velocity of the Earth in space constituted a privileged frame of reference. That's actually what it was called. Albert Einstein, a keen critic of prejudice and privilege all his life, considered this absolute physics a remnant of an increasingly discredited Earth chauvinism. It seemed to him that the laws of nature must be the same no matter what the velocity of the frame of reference of the observer. With this as a starting point, he developed the special theory of relativity. Its consequences are bizarre, counterintuitive. They grossly contradict common sense, but only at very high speeds. Careful and repeated observations show that his justly celebrated theory is an accurate description of how the world is made. Our common sense intuitions can be mistaken. Our preferences don't count. We do not live in a privileged reference frame. One consequence of special relativity is time dilation, the slowing down of time as the observer approaches light speed. You can still find claims that time dilation applies to watches and elementary particles, and presumably to circadian and other rhythms in plants, animals, and microbes, but not to human biological clocks. Our species has been granted, it is suggested, special immunity from the laws of nature, which must accordingly be able to distinguish deserving from undeserving collections of matter. In fact, the proof Einstein gave for special relativity admits no such distinctions. The idea of humans as exceptions to relativity seems just another incarnation of the notion of special creation. Special creation. Well, even if our position, our epoch, our motion, and our world are not unique, maybe we're different from the other animals. We're specially created. The particular devotion of the creator of the universe is evident in us. This position was passionately defended on religious and other grounds. But in the middle 19th century, Charles Darwin showed convincingly how one species can evolve into another by entirely natural processes, which come down to the heartless business of nature saving the heredities that work and rejecting those that don't. Man, in his arrogance, thinks himself a great work, worthy of the interposition of a deity. Darwin wrote telegraphically in his notebook, more humble, and I think truer, to consider him created from animals. Close quote. The profound and intimate connections of humans with the other life forms on Earth has been compellingly demonstrated understand the nature of human sexuality, the existence of the unconscious mind, and the fact that many psychiatric illnesses and character defects have a molecular origin. But also, well, even if we're closely related to some of the other animals, we're different. Not just in degree, but in kind. On what really matters: reasoning, self-consciousness, tool-making, ethics, altruism, religion, language, nobility of character. While humans, like all animals, have traits that set them apart, otherwise how could we distinguish one species from another? Human uniqueness has been exaggerated, sometimes grossly so. Chimps reason, are self-conscious, make tools, show devotion, and so on. Chimps and humans have 99.6% of their active genes in common. Andrian and I run through the evidence in our book Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. In popular culture, the very opposite position is also embraced, although it too is driven by human chauvinism, plus a failure of the imagination. Children's stories and cartoons make animals dress in clothes, live in houses, use knives and forks, and speak. The three bears sleep in beds. The owl and the pussycat go to sea in a beautiful pea-green boat. Dinosaur mothers cuddle their young. Pelicans deliver the mail. Dogs drive cars. A worm catches a thief. Pets have human names. Dolls, nutcrackers, cups and saucers dance and have opinions. The dish runs away with the spoon. In the Thomas the Tank Engine series, we even have anthropomorphic locomotives and railway cars charmingly portrayed. No matter what we're thinking about, animate or inanimate, we tend to invest it with human traits. We can't help ourselves. The images come readily to mind. Children are clearly fond of them. When we talk about a threatening sky, a trouble in the sea, diamonds resisting being scratched, the Earth attracting a passing asteroid, or an atom being excited, we are again drawn to a kind of animist worldview. We reify. Some ancient level of our thinking endows inanimate nature with life, passions, and forethought. The notion that the Earth is self-aware has lately been growing at the fringes of the Gaia hypothesis. But this was a commonplace belief of both the ancient Greeks and the early Christians. Origen wondered whether, quote, the Earth also, according to its own nature, is accountable for some sin, close quote. A host of ancient scholars thought the stars alive. This was also the position of Origen, of St. Ambrose, the mentor of St. Augustine, and even in a more qualified form of St. Thomas Aquinas. The Stoic philosophical position on the sun's nature was stated by Cicero in the 1st century BC, quote, since the sun resembles those fires which are contained in the bodies of living creatures, the sun must also be alive, close quote. Animist attitudes in general seem to have been spreading recently. In a 1954 American survey, 75% of people polled were willing to state that the sun is not alive. In 1989, though, only 30% could support so rash a proposition. On whether an automobile tire can feel anything, 90% of respondents denied emotions in 1954, but only 73% in 1989. We can recognize here a shortcoming, in some circumstances serious, in our ability to understand the world. Characteristically, willy-nilly, we seem compelled to project our own nature onto nature. Although this may result in a consistently distorted view of the world, it does have one great virtue. Projection is the essential precondition for compassion. Okay, maybe we're not much. Maybe we're humiliatingly related to apes. But at least we're the best there is. God and angels aside, we're the only intelligent beings in the universe. guess that the universe is filled with beings far more intelligent, far more advanced than we are. But of course, I might be wrong. Such a conclusion is at best based on a plausibility argument derived from the numbers of planets, the ubiquity of organic matter, the immense timescales available for evolution, and so on. It's not a scientific demonstration. The question is one of the most fascinating in all science. We're just developing tools to treat it seriously. What about the related matter of whether we're capable of creating intelligence that is smarter than ourselves? Computers routinely do mathematics, unaided human comprehension, outperform world champions in checkers, grandmasters in chess, speak and understand English and other languages, write presentable short stories and musical compositions, learn from their mistakes, and competently pilot ships, airplanes, and spacecraft. Their abilities steadily improve. They're getting smaller, faster, and cheaper. Every year, the tide of scientific advance laps a little further ashore on the island of human intellectual uniqueness with its embattled castaways. If, at so early a stage in our technological evolution, we have been able to go so far in creating intelligence of silicon and metal, what will be possible in the following decades and centuries? What happens when smart machines are able to manufacture smarter machines? Perhaps the clearest indication that the search for an unmerited privileged position for humans will never be wholly abandoned is what in physics and astronomy is called the anthropic principle. It would be better named the anthropocentric principle. It comes in various forms. The weak anthropic principle merely notes that if the laws of nature and the physical constants, such as the speed of light, the electrical charge of the electron, the Newtonian gravitational constant, or Planck's quantum mechanical constant, if these had been different, the course of events leading to the origin of humans would never have transpired. Under other laws and constants, atoms would not hold together, or stars would evolve too quickly to leave sufficient time for life to evolve on nearby planets, or the chemical elements of which life is made would never have been generated, and so on. Different laws, no humans. There is no controversy about the weak anthropic principle. Change the laws and the constants of nature, if you could, and a very different universe may emerge. In many cases, a universe incompatible with life. The mere fact that we exist implies, but does not impose, constraints on the laws of nature. By contrast, the various strong anthropic principles go much further. Some of their advocates come close to deducing that the laws of nature and the values of the physical constants were established, don't ask how or by whom, so that humans would eventually come to be. Almost all of the other possible universes, they say, are inhospitable. In this way, the ancient conceit that the universe was made for us is resuscitated. To me, it echoes Dr. Pangloss in Voltaire's Candide, convinced that this world, with all its imperfections, is the best possible. It sounds like playing my first hand of bridge, winning, knowing that there are 54 billion, that is 5.4 times 10 to the 28th, possible other hands that I was equally likely to have been dealt, and then foolishly concluding that a god of bridge exists, who favors me. A god who arranged the cards in the shuffle with my victory foreordained from the beginning. We do not know how many other winning hands there are in the cosmic deck, how many other kinds of universes, laws of nature, and physical constants that could also lead to life and intelligence, and perhaps even delusions of self-importance. Since we know next to nothing about how the universe was made, or even if it was made, it's difficult to pursue the universe without it. Voltaire asked, why is there any? Einstein's formulation was to ask, would the God have any choice in our universe? Because the universe is infinitely old. If the Big Bang some 15 million years ago is only the most recent cusp in a series of cosmic contractions and consistent with life? Now, first, of course, we're so lucky because if we weren't, we wouldn't be here to ask the question. It is no mystery that inquisitive beings who evolve on planets can be found only in universes that admit planets. Second, the inverse square law is not the only one consistent with stability over billions of years. Any power law less steep than 1 over r cubed, 1 over r to the 2.99 power, for example, or 1 over r, will keep a planet in the vicinity of a circular orbit, even if it's somehow given a shove. We have a tendency to overlook the possibility that other conceivable laws of nature might also be consistent with life. But there's a further point. It's not arbitrary that we have an inverse square law of gravitation. When Newton's theory is understood in terms of the more encompassing general theory of relativity, we recognize that the exponent of the gravity law is 2, because the number of physical dimensions we live in is 3. All gravity laws aren't available, free for a creator's choosing. Even given an infinite number of 3-dimensional universes for some great god to tinker with, the gravity law would always have to be the law of the inverse square. Newtonian gravity, we might say, is not a contingent facet of our universe, but a necessary one. In general relativity, gravity is due to the dimensionality and curvature of space. When we talk about gravity, we're talking about local dimples in space-time. This is by no means obvious and even affronts common-sense notions. But when examined deeply, the ideas of gravity and mass are not separate matters, but ramifications of the underlying geometry of space-time. I wonder if something like this doesn't apply generally to all anthropic hypotheses. The laws or physical constants on which our lives depend turn out to be members of a class, perhaps even a vast class, of other laws and other physical constants. But some of these are also compatible with a kind of life. Often we do not, or cannot, work through what those other universes allow. Beyond that, not every arbitrary choice of a law of nature or a physical constant may be available even to a maker of universes. Our understanding of which laws of nature and which physical constants are up for grabs is fragmentary at best. Moreover, we have no access to any of those putative alternative universes. We have no experimental method by which anthropic hypotheses may be tested. Even if the existence of such universes were to follow firmly from well-established theories of quantum mechanics or gravitation, say, we could not be sure that there weren't better theories that predict no alternative universes. Until that time comes, if it ever does, it seems to me premature to put faith in the anthropic principle as an argument for human centrality or uniqueness. Finally, even if the universe were intentionally created to allow for the emergence of life or intelligence, other beings may exist on countless worlds. If so, it would be cold comfort to anthropocentrists that we inhabit one of the few universes that allow life and intelligence. There's something stunningly narrow about how the anthropic principle is phrased. Yes, only certain laws and constants of nature are consistent with our kind of life, but essentially the same laws and constants are required to make a rock. So why not talk about a universe designed so rocks could one day come to be, and strong and weak lithic principles? If stones could philosophize, I imagine lithic principles would be at the intellectual frontiers. There are cosmological models being formulated today in which even the entire universe is nothing special. Andrei Lind, formerly of the Lebedev Physical Institute in Moscow, and now at Stanford University, has incorporated current understanding of the strong and weak nuclear forces and quantum physics into a new cosmological model. Lind envisions a vast cosmos, much larger than our universe, perhaps extending literally to infinity, both in space and time. Not the paltry 15 billion light years or so in radius, and 15 billion years in age, which are the usual understanding. In this cosmos, there is, as here, a kind of quantum fluff, in which tiny structures much smaller than an electron are everywhere forming, reshaping, and dissipating, in which, as here, fluctuations in absolutely empty space create pairs of elementary particles, an electron and a positron, for example. In the froth of quantum bubbles, the vast majority remain submicroscopic. But a tiny fraction inflate, grow, and achieve respectable universehood. They're so far away from us, though, much farther than the 15 billion light years that's the conventional scale of our universe, that if they exist, they appear to be wholly inaccessible and undetectable. Most of these other universes reach a maximum size and then collapse, contract to a point, and disappear forever. Others may oscillate. Still others may expand without limit. In different universes, there will be different laws of nature. We live, Lind argues, in one such universe, one in which the physics is congenial for growth, inflation, expansion, galaxies, stars, worlds, life. We imagine our universe to be unique, but it is one of an immense number, perhaps an infinite number, of equally valid, equally independent, equally isolated universes. There will be life in some and not in others. In this view, the observable universe is just a newly formed backwater of a much vaster, infinitely old, and wholly unobservable cosmos. If something like this is right, even our residual pride, pallid as it must be, of living in the only universe, is denied to us. Maybe someday, despite current evidence, a means will be devised to peer into adjacent universes, sporting very different laws of nature, and we will see what else is possible. Or perhaps inhabitants of adjacent universes can peer into ours. Of course, in such speculations, we have far exceeded the bounds of knowledge. But if something like Lind's cosmos is true, there is, amazingly, still another devastating deprovincialization awaiting us. Our powers are far from adequate to be creating universes anytime soon. Strong anthropic principle ideas are not amenable to proof, although Lind's cosmology does have some testable features. Extraterrestrial life aside, if self-congratulatory pretensions to centrality have now retreated to such bastions impervious to experiment, then I'd say that the sequence of scientific battles with human chauvinism seem to have been, at least largely, won. The long-standing view, as summarized by the philosopher Immanuel Kant, that without man, the whole of creation would be a mere wilderness, a thing in vain, and have no final end, is revealed to be self-indulgent folly. A principle of mediocrity seems to apply to all our circumstances. We would not have known beforehand that the evidence would be so repeatedly and thoroughly incompatible with the proposition that human beings are at center stage in the universe. But most of the debates have now been settled decisively in favor of a position that, however painful, can be encapsulated in a single sentence. We have not been given the lead in the cosmic drama. Perhaps someone else has. Perhaps no one else has. In either case, we have good reason for humility. Chapter 4. A universe not made for us. The sea of fate was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now, I only hear its melancholy long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear, and naked shimmers of the world. That's from Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach, 1867. What a beautiful sunset, we said. Or, I'm up before sunrise. No matter what the scientists allege, in everyday speech we often ignore their findings. We don't talk about the Earth turning, but about the sun rising and setting. Try formulating it in Copernican language. What would you say? Will you be home by the time the Earth has rotated enough so as to occult the sun below the local horizon? Billy would be long gone before you're finished. We haven't been able even to find a graceful locution that accurately conveys the heliocentric insight. We at the center, and everything else circling us, is built into our languages. We teach it to our children. We are unconstructed geocentrists, hiding behind a Copernican moon. In 1633, the Roman Catholic Church condemned Galileo for teaching that the Earth was around the sun. Let's take a closer look at this famous controversy. In the preface to his book comparing the two hypotheses, an Earth-centered and a sun-centered universe, Galileo had written these words: "The celestial phenomena will be examined, strengthening the Copernican hypothesis until it might seem that this must triumph absolutely." And later in the book he confessed, "Nor can I ever sufficiently admire Copernicus and his followers. They have, through sheer force of intellect, done such violence to their own senses as to prefer what reason told them over what sensible experience plainly showed them." The Church declared, in its indictment of Galileo, "The doctrine that the Earth is neither the center of the universe nor immovable, but moves even with a daily rotation, is absurd, and both psychologically and theologically false, and at the least an error of faith." Galileo replied, "The doctrine of the movements of the Earth and the fixity of the sun is condemned on the ground that the Scriptures speak in many places of the sun moving and the Earth standing still. It is piously spoken that the Scriptures cannot lie, but none will deny that they are frequently abstruse and their true meaning difficult to discover, and more than the bare words signify. I think that in the discussion of natural problems, we ought to begin not with the Scriptures, but with experiments and demonstrations." But in his recantation on June 22nd, 1633, Galileo was made to say these words: "Having been admonished by the Holy Office entirely to abandon the false opinion that the sun was the center of the universe and immovable, and that the Earth was not the center of the same, and that it moved, I have been suspected of heresy, that is, of having held and believed that the sun is the center of the universe and immovable, and that the Earth is not the center of the same, and that it does move. I abjure with a sincere heart and unfeigned faith, I curse and detest the same errors and heresies, and generally all and every error and sect contrary to the Holy Catholic Church." It took the Church until 1832 to remove Galileo's work from its list of books, which Catholics were forbidden to read at the risk of dire punishment of their immortal souls. Pontifical disquiet with modern science has ebbed and flowed since the time of Galileo. The high watermark in recent history is the 1864 Syllabus of Errors of Pius IX, the Pope who also convened the Vatican Council, at which the doctrine of papal infallibility was, at his insistence, first proclaimed. Here are a few excerpts from the Syllabus of Errors. "Divine revelation is perfect, and therefore it is not subject to continual and indefinite progress in order to correspond with the progress of human reason. No man is free to embrace and profess that religion which he believes to be true, guided by the light of reason. The Church has power to define dogmatically the religion of the Catholic Church to be the only true religion. It is necessary even in the present day that the Catholic religion shall be held as the only religion of the state, to the exclusion of all other forms of worship. The civil liberty of every mode of worship, and full power given to all of openly and publicly manifesting their opinions and their ideas, conduce more easily to corrupt the morals and minds of the people. The Roman pontiff cannot and ought not to reconcile himself or agree with progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. And so on. To its credit, although belatedly and reluctantly, the Church in 1992 repudiated its denunciation of Galileo. It still cannot quite bring itself, though, to see the significance of its opposition. In a 1992 speech, Pope John Paul II argued as follows. From the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment, he said, down to our own day, the Galileo case has been a sort of myth, in which the image fabricated out of the events is quite far removed from reality. In this perspective, the Galileo case was a symbol of the Catholic Church's supposed rejection of scientific progress, or of dogmatic obscurantism, opposed to the free search for truth. Close quote. But surely the Holy Inquisition, ushering the elderly and infirm Galileo in to inspect the instruments of torture in the dungeons of the Church, not only admits, but requires just such an interpretation. This was not mere scientific caution and restraint, a reluctance to shift the paradigm until compelling evidence, such as the annual parallax, was available. This was fear of discussion and debate, censoring alternative views, and threatening to torture their proponents, betray a lack of faith in the very doctrine and parishioners that are ostensibly being protected. Why were threats and Galileo's house arrest needed? Cannot truth defend itself in its confrontation with error? The Pope does, though, go on to add, quote, the error of the theologians of the time, when they maintained the centrality of the earth, was to think that our understanding of the physical world structure was in some way imposed by the literal sense of sacred scriptures. Close quote. Here indeed considerable progress has been made, although proponents of fundamentalist faiths will be distressed to hear from the pontiff that sacred scripture is not always literally true. But if the Bible is not everywhere literally true, which parts are divinely inspired and which are merely fallible and human? As soon as we admit that there are scriptural mistakes or concessions to the ignorance of the times, then how can the Bible be an inerrant guide to ethics and morals? Might sects and individuals now accept as authentic the parts of the Bible they like and reject those that are inconvenient or burdensome? Prohibitions against murder, say, are essential for a society to function. But if divine retribution for murder is considered implausible, won't more people think they can get away with it? Many felt that Copernicus and Galileo were up to no good, and worsening the social order. Indeed, any challenge from any source to the literal truth of the Bible might have some consequences. We can readily see science begin to make people nervous, instead of criticizing those who perpetuated the myths. Public mindset the idea so appealing? Why do we nurture it? Is our self-esteem so precarious that nothing short of a universe custom-made for us will do? Of course it appeals to our vanity. What a man desires, he also imagines to be true, said Demosthenes. The light of faith makes us see what we believe, cheerfully admitted St. Thomas Aquinas. But I think there may be something else. There's a kind of ethnocentrism among primates. To whichever little group we happen to be born, we owe passionate love and loyalty. Members of other groups are beneath contempt, deserving of rejection and hostility. That both groups are of the same species, that to an outside observer they are virtually indistinguishable, makes no difference. This is certainly the pattern among the chimpanzees, our closest relatives in the animal kingdom. Andrian and I have described how this way of viewing the world may have made enormous evolutionary sense a few million years ago, however dangerous it has become today. Even members of hunter-gatherer groups, as far from the technological feats of our present global civilization as it's possible for humans to be, solemnly describe their little band, whichever it is, as the people. Everyone else is something different, something less than human. If this is our natural way of viewing the world, then it should occasion no surprise that every time we make a naive judgment about our place in the universe, one untempered by careful and skeptical scientific examination, we almost always opt for the centrality of our group and circumstance. We want to believe, moreover, that these are objective facts and not our prejudices finding a sanctioned vent. So it's not much fun to have a gaggle of scientists incessantly haranguing us with, "You're ordinary, you're unimportant, your privileges are undeserved, there's nothing special about you." Even unexcitable people might after a while grow annoyed at this incantation and those who insist on chanting it. It almost seems that the scientists are getting some weird satisfaction out of putting humans down. Why can't they find a way in which we're superior? Lift our spirits, exalt us. In such debates, science, with its mantra of discouragement, feels cold and remote, dispassionate, detached, unresponsive to human needs. And again, if we're not important, not central, not the apple of God's eye, what is implied for our theologically based moral codes? The discovery of our true bearings in the cosmos was resisted for so long to such a degree that many traces of the debate remain, sometimes with the motives of the geocentrists laid bare. I want to read a revealing, unsigned commentary, more or less typical, in the British review The Spectator in 1892. Quote, "It is certain enough that the discovery of the heliocentric motion of the planets, which reduced our Earth to its proper insignificance in the solar system, did a good deal to reduce to a similar but far from proper insignificance the moral principles by which the predominant races of the Earth had hitherto been guided and restrained. Part of this effort was no doubt due to the evidence afforded that the physical science of various inspired writers was erroneous instead of being infallible, a conviction which unduly shook the confidence felt even in their moral and religious teachings. But a good deal of it was due only to the mere sense of insignificance with which man had contemplated himself, since he had discovered that he inhabits nothing but a very obscure corner of the universe instead of the central world around which sun, moon, and stars alike revolve. There can be no doubt that man may feel himself, and has often felt himself, a great deal too insignificant to be the object of any particular divine training or care. If the earth be regarded as a sort of anthill, and the life and death of human beings as the life and death of so many ants, which run into and out of so many holes in search of food and sunlight, it is quite certain that no adequate importance will be attached to the duties of human life, and that a profound fatalism and hopelessness instead of new hopefulness will attach to human effort. For the present, at least, the review concludes, our horizons are quite bad thing. Till we can get used to the infinite horizons we already have, and not lose our balance so much as we usually do in contemplating them, the yearning for still wider horizons is premature. So, what do we really want from philosophy and religion? Palliative? Therapy? Comfort? Do we want reassuring fables, or an understanding of our actual circumstances? Dismay that the universe does not conform to our preferences seems childish. You might think that grown-ups would be ashamed to put such disappointments into print. The fashionable way of doing this is not to blame the universe, which seems truly pointless, but rather to blame the means by which we know the universe, namely, science. George Bernard Shaw, in the preface to his play St. Joan, described a sense of science preying on our credulity, forcing on us an alien worldview, intimidating belief. Quote, in the Middle Ages, people believed that the earth was flat, for which they had at least the evidence of their senses. We believe it to be round not because as many as 1% of us could give a physical reason for so quaint a belief, but because modern science has convinced us that nothing that is obvious is true, and that everything that is magical, improbable, extraordinary, gigantic, microscopic, heartless, or outrageous is scientific. Close quote. A more recent and very instructive example is a book called Understanding the Present, Science and the Soul of Modern Man by Brian Appleyard, a British journalist. This book makes explicit what many people feel all over the world, but are too embarrassed to say. Appleyard's candor is refreshing. He is a true believer and will not let us slough over the contradictions between modern science and traditional religion. Science has taken away our religion, he laments. And what sort of religion is it that he longs for? One in which, quote, the human race was the point, the heart, the final cause of the whole system. It placed ourselves definitely upon the universal map. We were the end, the purpose, the rational axle around which the great etherian shells rotated. He longs for, quote, the universe of Catholic orthodoxy, in which, quote, the cosmos is shown to be a machine constructed around the drama of salvation, by which Appleyard means that despite explicit orders to the contrary, a woman and a man once ate of an apple, and that this act of insubordination transformed the universe into a contrivance for operant conditioning their remote descendants. By contrast, he says, modern science, quote, presents us as accidents. We are caused by the cosmos, but we are not the cause of it. Modern man is not finally anything. He has no role in creation, close quote. Science is, quote, spiritually corrosive, burning away ancient authorities and traditions. It cannot really coexist with anything. Science quietly and inexplicitly is talking us into abandoning ourselves, our true selves. Close quote. It reveals, quote, the mute, alien spectacle of nature. Human beings cannot live with such a revelation. The only morality left is that of the consoling lie. Close quote. Anything is better, he seems to be saying, than grappling with the unbearable burden of being tiny. In a passage reminiscent of Pius IX, Appleyard even decries the fact that, quote, a modern democracy can be expected to include a number of contradictory religious faiths, which are obliged to agree on a certain limited number of general injunctions, but no more. They must not burn each other's places of worship, but they may deny, even abuse each other's God. This is the effective scientific way of proceeding, close quote. But what is the alternative? Obdurately to pretend certainty in an uncertain world? To adopt a comforting belief system, no matter how out of kilter with the facts it is? If we don't know what's real, how can we deal with reality? For practical reasons, we can't live too much in fantasy land. Shall we censor one another's religions and burn down one another's places of worship? How can we be sure which of the thousands of human belief systems should become unchallenged, ubiquitous, man nerve before the universe, its grandeur and magnificence, but especially its indifference. Science has taught us that because we have a talent for deceiving ourselves, subjectivity may not freely reign. This is one reason Appleyard so mistrusts science. It seems too reasoned, measured, and impersonal. Its conclusions derive from the interrogation of nature, and are not in all cases pre-designed to satisfy our wants. Appleyard deplores moderation. He yearns for inerrant doctrine, release from the exercise of judgment, and an obligation to believe, but not to question. He has not grasped human fallibility. He recognizes no need to institutionalize error-correcting machinery, either in our social institutions or in our view of the universe. This is the anguished cry of the infant when the parent does not come. But most people eventually come to grips with reality, and with the painful absence of parents who will absolutely guarantee that no harm befalls the little ones so long as they do what they're told. Eventually, most people find ways to accommodate to the universe, especially when given the tools to think straight. All that we pass on to our children in the scientific age, Appleyard complains, quote, is the conviction that nothing is truly final or enduring, including the culture from which they spring, close quote. How right he is about the inadequacy of our legacy. But would it be enriched by adding baseless certainties? He scorns, quote, the pious hope that science and religion are independent realms which can easily be separated, close quote. Instead, he says, quote, science, as it is now, is absolutely not compatible with religion, close quote. But isn't Appleyard really saying that some religions now find it difficult to make unchallenged pronouncements on the nature of the world that are straight out false? We recognize that even revered religious leaders, the products of their time, as we are of ours, may have made mistakes. Religions contradict one another on small matters such as whether we should put on a hat or take one off on entering a house of worship, or whether we should eat beef and eschew pork or the other way around, all the way to the most central issues such as whether there are no gods, one God, or many gods. Science has brought many of us to that state in which Nathaniel Hawthorne found Herman Melville. He can neither believe, Hawthorne said, nor be comfortable in his unbelief. Or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, quote, they had not persuaded me, but they had troubled me. Their arguments had shaken me without ever convincing me. It is hard to prevent oneself from believing what one so keenly desires, close quote. As the belief systems taught by the secular and religious authorities are undermined, respect for authority in general probably does erode. The lesson is clear. Even political leaders must be wary of embracing false doctrine. This is not a failing of science, but one of its graces. Of course, worldview consensus is comforting, while clashes of opinion may be unsettling and demand more of us. But unless we insist against all evidence that our ancestors were perfect, the advance of knowledge requires us to unravel and then restitch the consensus they established. In some respects, science has far surpassed religion in delivering awe. How is it that hardly any major religion has looked at science and concluded, this is better than we thought. The universe is much bigger than our prophets said, grander, more subtle, more elegant. God must be even greater than we dreamed. Instead, they say, no, my God is a little God, and I want him to stay that way. A religion old or new that stressed the magnificence of the universe as revealed by modern science might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe hardly tapped by the conventional faiths. Sooner or later, such a religion will emerge. If you lived 2 or 3 millennia ago, there was no shame in holding that the universe was made for us. It was an appealing thesis consistent with everything we knew. It was what the most learned among us taught without qualification. found out much since then. Defending such a position today amounts to willful disregard of the evidence and a flight from self-knowledge. Still, for many of us, these deprovincializations rankle. Even if they do not fully carry the day, they erode confidence. Unlike the happy anthropocentric certitudes, rippling with social utility of an earlier age, we long to be here for a purpose, even though, despite much self-deception, none is evident. The meaningless absurdity of life, wrote Leo Tolstoy, is the only incontestable knowledge accessible to man. Close quote. Our time is burdened under the cumulative weight of successive debunkings of our conceits. We're Johnny-come-latelys. We live in the cosmic boondocks. We emerged from microbes and muck. Apes are our cousins. Our thoughts and feelings are not fully under our own control. There may be much smarter and very different beings elsewhere, and on top of all this, we're making a mess of our planet and becoming a danger to ourselves. The trapdoor beneath our feet swings open. We find ourselves in bottomless freefall. We are lost in a great darkness, and there's no one to send out a search party. Given so harsh a reality, of course we're tempted to shut our eyes and pretend that we're safe and snug at home, that the fall is only a bad dream. We lack consensus about our place in the universe. There is no generally agreed upon long-term vision of the goal of our species, other than, perhaps, simple survival. Especially when times are hard, we become desperate for encouragement, unreceptive to the litany of great devotions and dashed hopes, and much more willing to hear that we're special, never mind if the evidence is paper thin. If it takes a little myth and ritual to get us through a night that seems endless, who among us cannot sympathize and understand? But if our objective is deep knowledge rather than shallow reassurance, the gains from this new perspective far outweigh the losses. Once we overcome our fear of being tiny, we find ourselves on the threshold of a vast and awesome universe that utterly dwarfs, in time, in space, and in potential, the tidy anthropocentric proscene of our ancestors. We gaze across billions of light years of space to view the universe shortly after the Big Bang and plumb the fine structure of matter. We peer down into the core of our planet and the blazing interior of our star. We read the genetic language in which is written the diverse skills and propensities of every being on Earth. We uncover hidden chapters in the record of our own origins, and with some anguish, better understand our nature and prospects. We invent and refine agriculture, without which almost all of us would starve to death. We create medicines and vaccines that save the lives of billions. We communicate at the speed of light and whip around the Earth in an hour and a half. We have sent dozens of ships to more than 70 worlds and 4 spacecraft to the stars. We are right to rejoice in our accomplishments, to be proud that our species has been able to see so far, and to judge our merit, in part, by the very science that has so deflated our pretensions. To our ancestors, there was much in nature to be afraid of. Lightning, storms, earthquakes, volcanoes, plagues, drought, long winters. Religions arose in part as attempts to propitiate and control, if not much to understand, the disorderly aspects of nature. The scientific revolution permitted us to glimpse an underlying ordered universe in which there was a literal harmony of the worlds. That's Johannes Kepler's phrase. If we understand nature, there is a prospect of controlling it, or at least mitigating the harm it may bring. In this sense, science brought hope. Most of the great deprovincializing debates were entered into with no thought for their practical implications. Passionate and curious humans wish to understand their actual circumstances, how unique or pedestrian they in their world are, their ultimate origins, destinies, how the universe works. Surprisingly, some of these debates have yielded the most profound practical benefits. The very method of mathematical reasoning that Isaac Newton introduced to explain the motion of the planets around the sun has led to most of the technology of our modern world. The Industrial Revolution, for all its shortcomings, is still the global model of how an agricultural nation can emerge from poverty. These debates have bread and butter consequences. It might have been otherwise. It might have been that the balance lay elsewhere. That humans by and large did not want to know about a disquieted universe. That we were unwilling to permit challenges to the prevailing wisdom. Despite determined resistance in every age, it is very much to our credit that we've allowed ourselves to follow the evidence, to draw conclusions that at first seem daunting. A universe so much larger and older that our personal and historical experiences dwarf and humble. A universe in which every day suns are born and worlds obliterated. A universe in which humanity, newly arrived, clings to an obscure clod of matter. How much more satisfying had we been placed in a garden custom-made for us, its other occupants put there for us to use as we saw fit. There is a celebrated story in the Western tradition like this, except that not quite everything was there for us. There was one particular tree of which we were not to partake, a tree of knowledge. Knowledge and understanding and wisdom were forbidden to us in this story. We were to be kept ignorant. But we couldn't help ourselves. We were starving for knowledge, created hungry, you might say. This was the origin of all our troubles. In particular, it's why we no longer live in a garden. We found out too much. So long as we were incurious and obedient, I imagine, we could console ourselves with our importance and centrality, and tell ourselves that we were the reason the universe was made. As we began to indulge our curiosity, though, to explore, to learn how the universe really is, we expelled ourselves from Eden. Angels with a flaming sword were set as sentries at the gates of paradise to bar our return. The gardeners became exiles and wanderers. Occasionally, we mourn that lost world, but that, it seems to me, is maudlin and sentimental. We could not happily have remained ignorant forever. There is in this universe much of what seems to be designed. Every time we come upon it, we breathe a sigh of relief. We're forever hoping to find, or at least to safely reduce, a designer. But instead, we repeatedly discover that natural processes, collisional selection at worlds, say, or natural selection of gene pools, or even the convection pattern in a pot of boiling water, can extract order out of chaos and deceive us into deducing purpose where there is none. In everyday life, we often sense, in the bedrooms of teenagers or in national politics, that chaos is natural and order imposed from above. While there are deeper regularities in the universe than the simple circumstances we generally describe as orderly, all that order, simple and complex, seems to derive from laws of nature established at the Big Bang, or maybe earlier, rather than as a consequence of belated intervention by an imperfect deity. God is to be found in the details, is the famous dictum of the German scholar Aby Warburg. But amid much elegance and precision, the details of life in the universe also exhibit haphazard, jury-rigged arrangements, and much poor planning. What shall we make of this? An edifice abandoned early in construction by the architect? The evidence so far at least, and laws of nature aside, does not require a designer. Maybe there's one hiding, maddeningly unwilling to be revealed. Sometimes it seems a very slender hope. The significance of our lives and our fragile planet is then determined only by our own wisdom and courage. We are the custodians of life's meaning. We long for a parent to care for us, to forgive us our errors, to save us from our childish mistakes. but knowledge is preferable to ignorance. Better by far to embrace the hard truth than a reassuring faith. If we crave some cosmic purpose, then let us find ourselves a worthy goal. Chapter 5. Is there intelligent life on Earth? They journeyed a long time and found nothing. At length, they discerned a small light, which was the Earth. But they could not find the smallest reason to suspect that we and our fellow citizens of this globe have the honor to exist. That's from Voltaire's Micromegas, 1752. There are places in and around our great cities where the natural world has all but disappeared. You can make out streets and sidewalks, autos, parking garages, advertising billboards, monuments of glass and steel, but not a tree or a blade of grass or any animal, besides, of course, the humans. There are lots of humans. Only when you look straight up through the skyscraper canyons can you make out a star or a patch of blue. Reminders of what was there long before humans came to be. But the bright lights of the big cities bleach out the stars, and even that patch of blue is sometimes gone, tinted brown by industrial technology. It's not hard going to work every day in such a place to be impressed with ourselves. How we've transformed the Earth for our benefit and convenience. But a few hundred miles up or down, there are no humans. Apart from a thin film of life at the very surface of the Earth, an occasional intrepid spacecraft, and some radio static, our impact on the universe is nil. It knows nothing of us. You're an alien explorer, entering the solar system after a long journey through the blackness of interstellar space. You examine the planets of this homegrown star from afar. A pretty, some gray, some blue, some red, some yellow. You're interested in what kinds of worlds these are, whether their environments are static or changing, and especially whether there are life and intelligence. You have no prior knowledge of the Earth. You've just discovered its existence. There's a galactic epic that's imagined. Look, but don't touch. You can fly by these worlds. You can orbit them, but you are strictly forbidden to land. Under such constraints, could you figure out what the Earth's environment is like, and whether anything living there? As you approach, your first impression of the whole Earth is white clouds, white polar caps, brown continents, and some bluish substance that covers 2/3 of the surface. When you take the temperature of this world from the infrared radiation it emits, you find that most latitudes are above the freezing point of water, while the polar caps are below freezing. Water is a very abundant material in the universe. Polar caps made of solid water would be a reasonable guess, as well as clouds of solid and liquid water. You might also be tempted by the idea that the blue stuff is enormous quantities, kilometers deep, of liquid water. The suggestion is bizarre, at least as far as this solar system is concerned, because surface oceans of liquid water exist nowhere else. When you look in the visible and near-infrared spectrum for telltale signatures of chemical composition, sure enough, you discover water ice in the polar caps, and enough water vapor in the air to account for the clouds. This is also just the right amount that must exist because of evaporation. The oceans are in fact made of liquid water. The bizarre hypothesis, liquid water oceans, is confirmed. The spectrometers further reveal that the air on this world is 1/5 oxygen, O2, two oxygen atoms bound together. No other planet in the solar system has anything close to so much oxygen. Where did it all come from? The intense ultraviolet light from the sun breaks water, H2O, down into oxygen and hydrogen. And hydrogen, the lightest gas, quickly escapes to space. This is the source of O2 certain, but it doesn't give us much for comes out in vast amounts, is used on Earth to break water apart, except that there's no known way to do this without life. There would have to be plants, life forms colored by a pigment that strongly absorbs visible light, that knows how to split a water molecule by saving up the energy of 2 photons of light, that retains the H, excretes the O, and that uses the hydrogen thus liberated to synthesize organic molecules. The plants would have to be spread over much of the planet. All this is asking a lot. If you're a good skeptical scientist, so much O2 would not be proof of life. It certainly might be cause for suspicion. With all that oxygen, you're not surprised to discover ozone. Three oxygen atoms bound together in the atmosphere, because ultraviolet light makes ozone out of molecular oxygen, O2. The ozone then absorbs dangerous ultraviolet radiation. So, if the oxygen is due to life, there's a curious sense in which the life is protecting itself. But this life, like mere photosynthetic plants, a high level of intelligence is being applied. Mars having the continents more closely. You find there are conflicts between 2 kinds of regions. One shows the spectrum of one box as found in the mountains. But the other reveals material covering vast areas that strongly absorbs red light. Sequence shows all colors of the might be just the agent that ordinary visible light is being used to break water apart. Counts the oxygen in the air. It's another hint, this time a little stronger, of life. Not a bug here and there, but a planetary surface overflowing with life. The pigment is in fact chlorine. It absorbs blue light as well as red, and is responsible for the fact that plants are green. What you're seeing is a densely vegetated planet. So the Earth is revealed to possess 3 properties unique, at least in the solar system: oceans, oxygen, life. It's hard not to think that the ocean being the sites of origin, and oxygen the product of life. When you look carefully at the infrared spectrum, you discover the minor constituents of the air. In addition to water vapor, there is carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, CH4, and other gases that absorb the heat of the Earth and constitute into space at night. These gases warm the planet. Without them, the Earth would everywhere be below the freezing point of water. You've discovered this world's leaders. Methane and oxygen together in the same atmosphere. So peculiar. The laws of chemistry are very clear. In excess of O2, CH4 should be entirely converted to H2O and CO2. I'll say that word instead of symbol. In excess of oxygen, methane should be entirely converted into water and carbon dioxide. The process is so efficient that not a single molecule in all the Earth's atmosphere should be left. Instead, you find that 1 out of every million molecules is methane. That's an immense discrepancy. What could it be? The only possible explanation is that methane is being injected into the Earth's atmosphere so quickly that its chemical reaction with O2 can't keep pace. Where does all this methane come from? Maybe it seeps out of the deep interior of the Earth, but quantitatively this doesn't seem to work, and Mars and Venus don't have anything like this much methane. The only alternatives are biological. A conclusion that makes no assumptions about the chemistry of life or what it looks like, but follows merely from how unstable methane is in an oxygen atmosphere.
Saki.
In fact, the methane arises from such sources as bacteria, bugs, the cultivation of rice, the burning of vegetation, natural gas from oil wells, and bovine flatulence. In the oxygen atmosphere, methane is a sign of life. That the intestinal activities of cows should be detectable from the planetary space is a modulated signal, a complex sequence of ons and offs. No electrons in magnetic fields, no shock waves, no lightning discharges can generate something like this. Intelligent life seems to be the only possible explanation. Your conclusion that the radio transmission is due to technology on Earth holds no matter what the ons and offs mean. You don't have to decode a message to be sure it is a message. The signal is really, let's suppose, communications from the U.S. Navy to its distant nuclear-armed submarines. So, as an alien explorer, you would know that at least one species on Earth has achieved radio technology. Now, which one is it? The beings that make methane? Those that generate oxygen? The ones whose pigment colors the landscape? Or somebody else? Somebody more subtle? Someone not otherwise detectable to a spacecraft plummeting by. To search for this technological species, you might want to examine the Earth with finer and finer resolution, seeking, if not the beings themselves, at least their artifacts. You look first with a modest telescope, so the finest detail you can resolve is 1 or 2 kilometers across, say a mile. You can make out no monumental architecture, no strange formations, no unnatural reworking of the landscape. No signs of it. You see a dense atmosphere in motion. The abundant water must evaporate and then rain back down. Ancient impact craters, apparent on the Earth's nearby moon, are almost wholly absent on the Earth. There must then be a set of processes whereby new land is created and then eroded away in much less time than the age of this world. Running water is everything. As you look with finer definition, you find mountain ranges, river valleys, and many other indications that the planet is geologically active. There are also odd places surrounded by vegetation, which are themselves deep of plants. They look like discolored smudges. When you examine the Earth at about 100-meter resolution, it's about 300 feet the size of a football field, everything changes. The planet is revealed to be covered with straight lines, squares, rectangles, circles, sometimes huddling along riverbanks or nestling in lower slopes of mountains, sometimes stretching over plains, but rarely deserts or hot mountains, and absolutely never in the oceans. Their regularity, complexity, and distribution would be hard to explain except by life and intelligence, although a deeper understanding of function and purpose might be elusive. Perhaps you would conclude only that the dominant life forms have a simultaneous passion for territoriality and Euclidean geometry. At this resolution, you could not see them, much less know them. Many of the devegetated smudges are now revealed to have an underlying checkerboard geometry. These are the planet's cities. Over much of the landscape, and not just in the cities, there is a profusion of straight lines, squares, rectangles, circles. The dark smudges of the cities are revealed to be highly geometrized, with only a few patches of vegetation, themselves with highly regular boundaries, left intact. There are occasional triangles, and in one city, there's even a pentagon. When you take pictures at a meter resolution or better, you find that the crisscrossing straight lines within the cities and the long straight lines that join them with other cities are filled with streamlined, multicolored beings a few meters in length, politely running one behind the other in long, slow, orderly procession. They're very patient. One stream of beings stops, so another stream can continue at right angles. Periodically, the favor is returned. At night, they turn on 2 bright lights in front so they can see where they're going. Some, a privileged few, go into little houses when their workday is done, and there retire for the night. Most are homeless and sleep in the streets. At last, you've detected the source of all the technology, the dominant life forms on the planet. The streets of the cities and the roadways of the countryside are evidently built for their benefit. You might believe that you were really beginning to understand life on Earth. And perhaps you'd be right. If the resolution improved just a little further, you'd discover tiny parasites that occasionally enter and exit the dominant organisms. They play some deeper role, though, because a stationary dominant organism will often start up again just after it's reinfected by a parasite, and stop again just before the parasite is expelled. This is puzzling. But no one said life on Earth would be easy to understand. All the images you've taken so far are in reflected sunlight, that is, on the day side of the planet. Something most interesting is revealed when you photograph the Earth at night. The planet is lit up. The brightest region, near the Arctic Circle, is illuminated by the aurora borealis, generated not by life, but by electrons and protons from the sun, beamed down by the Earth's magnetic field. Everything else you see is due to life. The lights recognizably outline the same continents that you can make out in daytime, and many correspond to cities you've already mapped. The cities are concentrated near coastlines. They tend to be sparser in continental interiors. Perhaps the dominant organisms are desperate for seawater, or maybe ocean-going ships were once essential for commerce and immigration. Some of the lights, though, are not due to cities. In North Africa, the Middle East, and Siberia, for example, there are very bright lights in a comparatively barren landscape, due, it turns out, to burn-off in oil and natural gas wells. In the Sea of Japan, on the day you first look, there's a strange